Among folks who care deeply about the Second Amendment and responsible gun ownership, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, better known as the ATF, has developed a bit of a reputation, and not in a good way. Rather than focusing their efforts on dismantling real criminal operations, they've gained notoriety for making life a nightmare for everyday gun owners and small firearms dealers who are just trying to follow the rules. There are plenty of reports of licensed dealers getting shut down over tiny clerical issues, things like mismatched serial numbers or missignatures, mistakes that have nothing to do with criminal intent. The ATF claims this red tape is meant to stop illegal firearms from hitting the streets, but a lot of us in the gun community see it as more of a show of force than a meaningful tactic against bad actors. One of the more recent flashpoints is their push to limit the resale of surplus police firearms, arguing they might someday end up in criminal hands. But that raises a bigger question. Are these policies really making the public safer, or are they just another way to chip away at lawful gun ownership? What's troubling isn't just the ATF's past missteps in major sting operations or botched raids. It's this newer, quieter, push-through policy changes and bureaucratic pressure. The so-called zero-tolerance strategy has become a tool to strip federal licenses from gun shops over the most minor infractions, even if the dealer has an otherwise spotless record. For mom and pop shops, this kind of enforcement can mean shutting down a family business over a typo or misplaced form. These are not the people supplying the black market with firearms. They're often the ones going above and beyond to comply with the law. But with this kind of heavy-handed approach, it's easy to feel like the real goal isn't stopping crime, it's wearing down the legal side of the firearms world through attrition. We're also seeing the rules shift in ways that blur the line between being a hobbyist and being considered in the business of selling guns. Thanks to executive orders, someone who sells just a few firearms from their private collection could suddenly be forced to get a federal firearms license or face criminal charges. That kind of overreach makes it risky for casual collectors and private individuals who've always tried to do things by the book. To many of us, it looks like a strategy built on choking off legal transactions with red tape, since outright bans are politically risky. Meanwhile, actual criminals continue to get their hands on guns through theft, straw purchases, and illegal sales that completely sidestep any of these rules. It's frustrating when those playing by the rules are the ones punished the most. This kind of overregulation has now started hitting law enforcement agencies too. For decades, police departments across the country have relied on reselling their older handguns or patrol rifles to fund the purchase of updated gear, whether it's new sidearms, body armor, or upgraded training tools. Now, the ATF is suggesting these resales are dangerous because the guns might, eventually, end up with the wrong person. But here's the thing, these sales usually happen through licensed dealers and come with full background checks. There's already a system in place to make sure those guns don't fall into the hands of prohibited buyers. Instead of focusing on street-level crime or gang activity, the ATF appears more concerned with tightening the screws on those already following the rules. For local police, especially departments operating with tight budgets, selling their older duty weapons has been a practical way to stretch every dollar. Trading in a batch of worn-out service pistols for new firearms or body armor is often the only feasible option to keep their officers well-equipped. But now, based on the idea that a resold law enforcement gun might someday be stolen or misused, the ATF wants departments to reconsider those sales. Both officers and Second Amendment advocates are skeptical of that logic. These transactions are already regulated. If a firearm that was legally sold later gets stolen and used in a crime, that doesn't mean the original sale was irresponsible. Criminal misuse doesn't negate the legal path the firearm initially took. Going after police trade-ins seems more like a symbolic gesture than a real solution, and it does little to address the root of violent crime. What might seem like a small matter on the surface is actually sending up red flags for gun owners and Second Amendment supporters. When the ATF starts nitpicking how local police departments handle the resale of their own firearms, it raises legitimate concerns about what could be next. If law enforcement is under that level of scrutiny, then it's not a stretch to think that private gun sales or transfers at gun shows could be targeted in similar fashion. For many folks in the firearms community, this looks like a deliberate effort to blur the distinction between lawful activity and criminal behavior, making it easier to justify more federal overreach. That kind of messaging builds distrust, especially when the government seems more interested in tying the hands of responsible gun owners than in shutting down the real sources of illegal firearms. The worry is that everyday Americans who follow the rules will pay the price for new restrictions that ultimately do nothing to stop the criminals who continue to get guns through theft, straw purchases, and the black market. In a nation where the right to bear arms is part of our core identity, these federal moves are creating a growing divide between the government and the people it's supposed to serve. The ATF has cited a figure over 52,000 police-owned firearms, supposedly linked to crimes over a 20-year span. That might sound serious at first, but when you break it down, it averages out to about 2,600 guns per year. Considering the hundreds of thousands of gun-related incidents that happen annually in the United States, that's a drop in the bucket. And the real kicker? That number doesn't even tell the full story. A good chunk of those guns could have been stolen from police lockers, misplaced, or ended up in the wrong hands through completely unrelated channels, not through legitimate trade-ins. By lumping all of those cases together, the ATF creates the illusion that law enforcement resale programs are a major source of crime guns, even though the data doesn't back that up. It feels like a clever way to push more restrictions without clearly stating the actual risk. If we're being honest about where criminals are getting their firearms, the answer hasn't changed much over the years. Most of them are not walking into gun shops and filling out forms. They're getting their guns through break-ins, back alley deals, or through someone else buying a gun on their behalf, a straw purchase. The Bureau of Justice Statistics has shown time and time again that the majority of firearms used in crimes come from illegal channels. These sources don't involve background checks, paperwork, or any kind of accountability. Meanwhile, firearms being cycled out of police inventories are sold through licensed dealers who follow every rule in the book. From a logical standpoint, the ATF's focus on these legal sales looks more like fear-mongering than a meaningful safety initiative. If the real goal is cutting down on gun violence, going after official police trade-in programs isn't going to move the needle. The bigger fight is with illegal trafficking networks that continue to operate in the shadows. It's this repeated use of vague or misleading statistics that's driving a wedge between law-abiding gun owners and federal agencies. When the public hears about 52,000 law enforcement guns tied to crime scenes, they might assume these firearms were handed straight to criminals, which simply isn't the case. That kind of misunderstanding works in the ATF's favor, giving them political cover to introduce new policies that burden legal gun owners while sidestepping real issues. This isn't the first time the ATF has come under fire for targeting legal firearm transactions while dropping the ball on actual gun smuggling operations. The now infamous Fast and Furious operation is still fresh in many minds, a botched plan where the ATF lost control of firearms that later surfaced at crime scenes, including one where a U.S. Border Patrol agent lost his life. That scandal damaged the agency's credibility in a big way. And yet, even after that, the ATF's own data shows that between 2016 and 2023, over 72,000 firearms vanished from licensed dealers, more than the total number of reported gun thefts in that same period. That's not coming from critics, that's straight from AFGov. And still, rather than fixing those issues, the agency has turned its attention towards so-called ghost guns, homemade firearms that are legal under the Second Amendment. They claim there's been a 1,600% increase in these types of weapons, using that number as justification for expanding their authority, even as real crime guns continue to flood the streets due to failures in enforcement where it actually matters. Rather than focusing their efforts on curbing gun smuggling by criminal cartels, cracking down on straw purchasers, or fixing the internal failures that have led to tens of thousands of firearms slipping through the cracks of federal oversight, the ATF has turned its attention to a much easier target: local police departments legally reselling their used firearms. To many, this move seems less about real crime prevention and more about optics. Targeting lawful dealers, municipal police, and responsible private gun owners allows the agency to give the illusion of action while sidestepping the tough work of dismantling dangerous criminal networks. Every new advisory or guideline handed down by the ATF is seen by critics as yet another small step in sidelining the very people who obey the law, while doing little to actually curb the violence perpetrated by those who do not. For a growing number of Americans, what once seemed like a fringe opinion calling for the ATF's dissolution is starting to look like a necessary step to preserve Second Amendment freedoms from bureaucratic erosion. The agency's recent advisories cautioning police departments against selling their surplus firearms are being interpreted as part of a larger game plan. If the ATF can successfully paint these legal sales as a public safety risk, then the door opens to target private transactions next. Critics warn that this isn't just about oversight, it's about expanding federal control to the point where every firearm transfer requires layers of government paperwork and compliance. The groundwork is already laid. If guns sold by law enforcement can be portrayed as fueling criminal activity despite passing through legal channels, then it becomes easier to justify regulating or even banning private sales altogether. We've already seen this unfold in several states, where exchanging a firearm between family members now involves background checks and government forms. On the federal level, the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act of 2022 is viewed by some as a calculated step in that same direction, expanding surveillance under the guise of safety without putting a dent in actual criminal behavior. Now, law enforcement agencies face a decision that carries both political and financial weight. They can either stand their ground, continue selling their used firearms through federally licensed dealers, and push back against this narrative, or they can give in, cut off a source of much-needed funding, and in doing so, validate the ATF's position. Organizations like Gun Owners of America and the Second Amendment Foundation are pushing back through the courts, backed by grassroots support from gun owners across the country. These groups rely on public awareness, donations, and active citizen engagement to challenge regulatory overreach. One effective avenue is local involvement. If residents make their voices heard and demonstrate support for lawful police resale programs, police leadership may be more inclined to resist pressure from Washington. At the heart of this issue is a broader political fight. Voters are being urged to back candidates who prioritize the rights of legal gun owners over those who cater to anti-gun organizations and lobbyists. That some lawmakers are now publicly advocating to abolish the ATF altogether speaks volumes about how far public frustration has reached. The growing belief is that the agency no longer functions as a neutral law enforcement entity, but rather as a political tool being used to undermine constitutional rights. In the eyes of many, the ATF's true focus isn't on stopping gun crime, it's about increasing regulation of people who already follow the law. Today, the pressure is on law enforcement trade-ins, but if left unchecked, private sales could easily become the next target. That's why it's crucial for gun owners and concerned citizens to remain active. Speak out against misleading narratives, support the organizations challenging these policies, and stay engaged with your local representatives. The fight for the Second Amendment is not just historical, it is happening now. And its outcome depends on how many people are willing to stand up and be counted.